On the Latin American side, Argentine intellectual Manuel Ugarte, Chilean poet Gabriela Mistral, and Mexican philosopher and politician Jose Vasconcelos all readily and positively responded to Graves' plea to express outrage over current Peruvian politics in favor of someone they once considered a friend. For Romain Rolland, once again, he comes into play. Letting Graves down, with whom he had been exchanging letters and sharing opinions for more than 8 years, was out of the question. Thus, upon hearing about the plan she was beginning to put together in May 1932, and in spite of personal reservations he held regarding Aya de la Torre's past inconsistency, right, they were very close, then there were some fights, and they had kept their distance a bit. Well, despite this, Rolland sent a cablegram directly to President Sanchez Cerro, forthrightly asking him to show respect for the individual Aya de la Torre, whose association with the, and I quote, pensée ibérique, so he writes in French, but mainly el pensamiento ibérico, Rolland tactically underscores, does it honor. Charles A. Thompson was first contacted by Graves toward the end of 1932. As the appointed traveling secretary in Central America and the Caribbean for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the FOR, which was a religious pacifist organization, Thompson was not unfamiliar with Aprista political contributions. In fact, Aya de la Torre's definition of imperialism had convinced him less than 2 years earlier that if fighting political expressions of imperialist phenomena was legitimate, then the flawed nature of economic expansion also deserved attention. So basically, Charles Thompson had never met Aya at this point, but being part of a religious pacifist organization, he was interested in anti-imperialist philosophies and was greatly influenced by the writings of Aya de la Torre, right? So unsurprisingly, in addition to agreeing to sign Graves' draft petition, Thompson also endeavored to muster supplementary signatures within his own inner circles. These examples showcase the assorted nature of Apra allies in the early 1930s. These included ex-confidants of Aya de la Torre, disgruntled by the estrangement that the passing of time had imposed on waning but nonetheless loyal friendships. He had been very close to Jose Vasconcelos, then they had a few fights, but they remained loyal. And others like Charles A. Thompson, disposed to politically support a thinker whose intellectual work had once been a source of inspiration and formation. All of them had either personally known Aya de la Torre or were closely acquainted with his work. In these instances, Graves' appeal triggered solidarity of action among allies whose assistance coalesced around the cognizance of Apra and shared memories of the individual Aya de la Torre. Other petitioners, however, had never met or, for a few, even heard of the imprisoned political leader who, as a man of great distinction, and I quote, must arouse the concern of many who in general are without interest in the politics of South America, end of quote, a series of English intellectuals assured their readers in the page of the Manchester Guardian, right? So even in Europe, you have intellectuals transforming Aya de la Torre into a symbol of democracy in Latin America, and this will play in favor of Apra. To attract attention to Aya de la Torre's situation, Graves never failed to include a newspaper clipping of this open letter, along with a copy of the draft petition when initially reaching out to potential Apra backers. The value of this letter as promotional device rested on the fact that it gave basic and accessible information on recent events in Peru and rendered the arrests and exiles of Aprista congressmen intelligible for an uninformed audience. Moreover, it depicted Aya de la Torre's leadership as a model of proper and desirable resistance to imperialism and of hope for Latin American unity. In spite of initial communist inclinations, and I quote, towards the end of 1927, the letter comforted its transatlantic audience. So they wanted to reassure their readers mainly by saying, yeah, sure, Aya de la Torre had been close perhaps to communist circles, but since the end of 1927, I quote, those members of the Apra who stood for revolutionary action repudiated Aya de la Torre's leadership, end of quote. So similar to the petition draft, the signers of the Manchester Guardian letter evidently labored to dissociate Aya de la Torre from the Trujillo uprising, as well as from any radical wing of the Apra movement altogether. In other words, the contents of these documents suggested that between authoritarian regimes on one side, right, in Latin America with Benavides in power, and a Comintern class baseline on the other, at the time it was Sanchez Cerro still, both were military men. So between authoritarian regimes on one side and then a Comintern class baseline on the other, an Apra placed under the sole leadership of Victor Raúl Aya de la Torre posed an attractive lesser evil, not only for Peru, but also for Latin America as a whole, actually, right? He was a model of moderate anti-imperialism for these North American and European intellectuals. Okay, so among those who learned about Apra and its imprisoned leader through the material that Graves sent, those who agreed to add their names to the petition usually did so to honor a system where interdependence and mutual exchange of favors secured cohesion and solidarity of action in the face of adversity, right? Collected signatures in these cases gave evidence of the respect many paid to Graves as an international activist, much more so than to a sudden urge to defend a political party with which they were not very familiar. So some knew Apra, others did not, but they said, well, Graves, whom we know for being such an idealist political activist, if she praises for Apra, sure, I'll write my name as well and I'll start to root for Apra, which is very telling for understanding the role that certain foreign allies have played for Apra in general. Right? Of course, it didn't hurt that the information that Graves was spreading through liberal leftist and Christian circles framed Aprista Aya de la Torre as a moderate, anti-communist agent deprived of basic political rights and civil liberties. So the correlation between a culture of reciprocity and shared political agendas is what appears to have secured the assistance of Christian actors such as Father McGowan, who, as Assistant Director of the Anti-Communist National Catholic Welfare Conference, Department of Social Action, agreed to utilize his aura of authority to present the final version of the petition to the Peruvian ambassador in the United States. Similarly, when Graves first tested the waters with Minister John Hayne Holmes from the Community Church of New York, Holmes confirmed remembering her all right, I remember her all right, and not without consenting to assisting her project however he could. I'm certainly grateful to you, Holmes cheerfully thanked Graves, for giving me this opportunity to help in a good cause. Although Nobel Peace Prize recipients Jane Addams and Emily Green Balch showed no indication of knowing about Apra, both signed the petition upon Graves' request. They no doubt owned loyalty not only to Graves, their longtime activist friend and colleague from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, but to the ideals of peace, democracy, and civil rights that Graves' initiative purportedly defended. What is more, evidence in archives suggests that in addition to signing the petition, Adams and Green actively promoted this case of justice that Graves so heartily stood up for within their immediate social circles. So as mentioned earlier, right, the rationale behind the transnational liberation campaign that Graves and allies orchestrated was to exert enough international pressure to compel the Peruvian authorities to be accountable to their commitment of free government and, as the petitioners ominously put it, the preservation of the, and I quote, good name of Peru before the world. So they were saying to the Peruvian authorities, watch out, the world is looking at you for what you're doing. If you claim to be a democracy, you have no right to arbitrarily arrest these political leaders and maintain them into the poor imprisonment conditions that you are. In the Peruvian fall of 1933, so las estaciones, how do you say estaciones? The seasons are reversed, right? So in the Peruvian fall of 1933, so in the spring of 1933, rumors started circulating that Aya de la Torre's conditions of incarceration had improved thanks to international support. I quote, "The letter and the news of the petition together will doubtless have been responsible for the better conditions which Victor is now enjoying." End of quote. John A. Mackay told Graves in March 1933. John A. Mackay, important figure to friend of Aya de la Torre in the 1920s, a reverend, a Christian missionary in Peru who continued to be a source of support to Aya de la Torre and Apra in the 1930s. In this case, he's talking to Grace because, of course, all of these allies, they talk to one another in developing their networks. So Mackay was referring to a letter he had written earlier to Antonio Miro Quesada in hopes that though Miro Quesada was a personal enemy of Aya de la Torre, he would honor the respect that he held for Mackay and use his political sway in favor of the Apra leader. The fact that the League of Nations had recently declared Peru's conduct unfit in its border conflict with Colombia may very well have helped persuade the Sanchez-Cerro government that, to better protect its international reputation, alleviating the weight of repression where public opinion was prone to mobilizing represented a suitable compromise. Right? So let me stop here with this case study just by saying that eventually there's an escalation of the crisis because an Alija Prista kills Sanchez-Cerro, another military man comes into power, Benavides, but ultimately Victor Raúl Aya de la Torre, it works, the liberation campaign works, he's being freed. He's being freed, he gets out of prison, and the first thing he does, Aya de la Torre, is to thank the public opinion for the pressure that it exerted on the Peruvian authority. He's the first one to recognize the weight that this liberation campaign had for him. So there's many things we can take out from this case study, in addition to showing to you that sometimes it would defend personally individual leaders of the party, right? And something we can take leads us to our third point. So everyday workings in the defense of party leaders, and then the third point, as I told you, is to help put Apra on the map, to help attract the interest of international public opinion to the case of state persecution in Peru. I will be brief in this point because there's a lot you can take from the liberation campaign in attracting new constituencies, right? The example I gave you, it shows that the impact that foreign allies had on public opinion outside Peru and the pressure that they exerted on powerful actors not only helped fight Aprista persecution. Coming together to defend Apra in moments of crisis while portraying it as a buffer against the advance of communism in the region, which they feared so much, right? The progressive liberal left in the US. So it helped assemble clusters of sympathy around Apra and, as a result, contributed to gathering political constituencies to its cause, okay, through the courtship that Grace had done with many of her own allies. So what happens in the 1930s is that Apra leaders, they become very aware of the benefits that they can receive out of these international networks. They are in using them to their own benefits.